Emmerdale's latest Dylan Penders update spells trouble for Ray and Celia. And just when Ray Walters and Celia Daniels think they've tightened their grip on April Windsor's life, a new development threatens to blow their whole operation apart. What strikes me most this week is how hope and dread seem to sit side by side for Maren and Rona, a fragile balance that could shatter at any moment. After a harrowing week in hospital, Dylan Penders finally shows signs of improvement. It's a moment I think many viewers have been quietly praying for. Not just because Dylan deserves justice, but because his recovery could be the lifeline April needs. Dylan was deliberately mown down by Ray after urging April to go to the police. An attack as chilling as it was calculated meant to terrify her family into silence. Tonight, the tone shifts when Patty delivers news that feels nothing short of miraculous. Dylan has turned a corner, and doctors are cautiously optimistic that they may be able to wake him within the next couple of days. Patty's relief is palpable, and honestly, it's impossible not to share it. This boy has endured far too much for simply doing the right thing. But back in the village, the good news sparks a different kind of conversation. For Maren and Rona, Dylan's recovery isn't just hopeful, it's strategic. They're still trapped under Ray's ultimatum: keep April running drugs or keep paying. And since neither option can keep their daughter safe forever, the idea that Dylan might identify his attacker feels like the first genuine shift in power. When Dylan's slow rise from the dark felt like a wind blowing through a house of cards, Patty appeared at the doorway with the kind of grin that had not yet learned to trust itself. Her nurse's face was lined with cautious victory. "He's better," she said before Maren could stand up. "The swelling's down. We can lighten the sedation. It's early, but—" her voice trembled on the word like a bird on a wire. Hope is a strange animal. For Maren and Rona it felt like permission to breathe, like the first thaw of ice that had held their lives frozen. "He's going to wake, isn't he?" Rona asked, and her voice frayed at the edges. Patty hesitated, then nodded. "There's a window. We think, with physiotherapy and time, he'll wake within a few days. He's young. He's strong." The relief that poured from Rona was audible, raw and immediate. She squeezed Maren's hand with an animal urgency. "If he remembers, if he tells," she began, the sentence a missile aimed at a single target. Maren let the thought hang like a halo. "He'll tell. He'll tell them." Across the village, where rain glassed the cobbles and gossip hummed like a hive, Ray Walters and Celia Daniels felt the shift first in the small things. A silence in the pub when they walked in, a look from a man who'd once kept his head down now carrying something like a warning. For months they had run a tight operation, disciplined and cruel. Ray's jaw had always been a taut wire, Celia's eyes a ledger. They had assumed power could buy silence and fear could buy obedience. They had not accounted for a boy who refused to be erased. When news of Dylan's recovery seeped to them, it always did, through the same oiled channels that had carried their threats, Ray's mouth went thin. He paced his kitchen, a fist knocking the rhythm of his temper against weathered countertops. "If he wakes and talks, it's over," he said. Celia, who liked to plan like chess players who never blinked, looked at him with a quiet fury. "Then we stop him from talking." In the Windsor household, April listened as her parents discussed contingencies like surgeons reading charts. She was no stranger to fear. She had been surviving under Ray's shadow, keeping payments in a dead envelope, taking deliveries that tasted like poison. She had seen the way eyes dimmed when his name was mentioned. She had felt the way he watched, always calculating. But there was a burnished, other feeling inside her now, a small, dauntless hope. If Dylan woke, it could be the off-ramp she had been praying for. Evidence that could unmask the people who had built a kingdom on other people's terror. The first time Dylan's eyelids fluttered, it was as if the village itself inhaled. Maren was by his bedside, his hand clasped over Dylan's small one with the devotion of a man who felt his world would split without that grip. Rona stood at the foot of the bed, whispering words that sounded like spells. There were moments, quick and brittle, when Dylan's fingers tugged at the blanket, when his breath altered as if remembering how to be his own. "Slow," whispered the doctor, clipping onto monitors. "Prompt him gently. We don't want an overstimulated reaction." So they spoke softly, names and places and memories. Maren told him about the dog that had chewed socks. Rona hummed old nursery songs that had once ironed the edges of evenings. The room held quiet things. The beep of machines, the scratch of a pen as a nurse marked a chart, the muffled murmur of traffic like something far away. Then, like a window opening onto a new season, Dylan responded. His eyes rolled, then focused. The first syllable that escaped his mouth was a rasp, a planet gaining atmosphere. "Ray," he croaked. The word landed with the weight of a verdict. Rona's knees gave. Marin clapped a hand over his mouth to muffle a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Word traveled faster than light among those who wanted change. Dylan had said the name. He had recognized the man who had driven him off the road. He had remembered .at the Woolpack. Gossip began to mutate into courage. Locals who had previously crossed the road when Ray passed now found themselves glancing at their phones, fingers hovering above police numbers. The police themselves, slow to act in a community that preferred the quiet, found momentum in the fragility of a boy's awakening. Sergeant Lewis called in file boxes. Inspector Graves dusted off the sort of determination that had the feel of overdue truth. But Ray and Celia's panic was a thing of deliberate beauty. It sharpened them. They did not sit and wait to be unmade. Celia, who in private could be a hurricane of plans, took action first. She whispered, calmed, and executed. Ray started visiting men who had once been loyal by dint of debt and fear, promising them new deals, threats thinly veiled as favors. They tried the old playbook: bribe, threaten, relocate. It had worked before. Perhaps they reasoned it would work again. And yet, around every corner of their strategy, life kept sprouting roots they had not intended. People met in kitchens and church halls, and the village's collective conscience creaked awake. There were not many, but there were enough. A butcher who had once bought loyalty like meat from a supplier now stood in the rain and told a policeman what he'd seen. A teenager who had hated the way April flinched lent testimony that made the police sit straighter. It began to feel like the kind of small rebellion that swelled into something unstoppable. Dylan's recovery was not linear. There were setbacks, nightmares, a childlike rage at the tubes, the fear when flashbacks crawled down his spine. He would wake in the night and startle, liable to confabulate under pain and medication. But clarity came in fits and starts. Names arrived linked to faces like puzzle pieces snapping in place. Marin and Rona shepherded him carefully, a love that wrapped around broken things and made them whole enough to stand. The night he gave his first full account to a detective, the pub was emptying. The village sleep-blurred and gullible to quiet. Marin and Rona sat stiffly in the waiting room, hands braced like anchors. Dylan told his story with the texture of someone who had survived when he should not have. He spoke of the car lights, the sudden force, the man's voice. He said Ray Walter's name without trembling. He said Celia's when he remembered the woman who had watched with a look that felt like satisfaction. For the police, Dylan's words were a linchpin. The evidence that had seemed thin, a smear here, a hearsay there, found structure in a witness who had remembered. Statements were made official. Warrants were drafted in the early dirty hours of the morning. Arrests were a legal, clinical thing. But within the community, they had hard edges. The feel of a tide pulling back to reveal the mess beachgoers had avoided looking at. When the operation was executed, Ray snarled and fought like a trapped animal. He had believed himself untouchable. Celia, who had always measured her risks and her gains with the eyes of a woman used to balancing ledgers of fear, tried bargaining. She called men who had been bought before and found they now had courage like currency. The village didn't want their money, it wanted its life back. Ray was arrested in the street outside the garage he'd used as a front. It was not cinematic, no dramatic chase, no final monologue. Instead, it was a man in overalls, hands cuffed, the rain making his hair slick to his skull. Celia was taken the next day, a look of disbelief turning slowly to fury as she realized that even her cleverness had limits. The duo that had so skillfully woven silence into the village's fabric found themselves unstitched in front of neighbors who had finally learned how to speak. The immediate aftermath was messy and human. People cheered in small ways. A clap at the allotments, a cheer when the police left the square. But there was also a shakier thing to reckon with. Fear does not evaporate just because its architects are behind bars. The village would need to heal. April's muscles were taut with the aftershocks of what she'd done and what had been done to her. She felt guilty and grateful in a tangle that made her sometimes stagger when she walked into her own kitchen. Marin and Rona, for all their relief, found no simple closure. They had been forced into decisions no parent should face. Marin could not unsee the curve of Dylan's face as he regained consciousness. Rona would forever hear the breath of that hospital room in quiet hours. But there was tenderness now that had been forged in the crucible of fear. They sat on a bench by the river, the sky a bruised lavender, and let the world be ordinary enough to breathe in. "You did it," Rona told April one afternoon, her voice thin with everything she had swallowed. April's eyes had a tired shine that belonged to someone who had been given a second chance at a life that could be different. "I didn't do it alone," April said. Dylan did. He told the truth. Dylan's presence in the village became a slow reclamation. He returned to school with a mixture of bashful pride and guarded weariness. Children who had assumed silence was stronger than them now looked at him with admiration. He would sometimes wander to the riverbank, where Marin would join him with sandwiches wrapped in cling film. They would talk about small things, football, a boy's favorite comic, the stupid jokes that took the edge off. There were nights when Dylan would wake with nightmares and Marin would hold him until sweat cooled on his forehead. Healing was not linear. Sometimes it felt like an argument with time itself. The legal machinery churned away as evidence was collated and witnesses prepared. Ray and Celia tried to mount defenses that looked like desperation. They hired lawyers and spun stories that bent like reeds. But the arc of their cruelty was laid bare. A catalogue of intimidation and violence that a village once policed by fear had finally chosen to confront. When the trial opened, people came with a guarded expectation. Not for spectacle, but for the rightness of things being called what they were. In court, Dylan was brave in a way that surprised even him. He spoke plainly about the night, about the car, about the fear. He did not make himself into a martyr. He simply told the truth as it had been given to him. Marin and Rona watched him like two harbor lights seeing their child's shape against the dark. April sat nearby, her hands folded, the steadying presence of someone who had been brave in a different way. The verdicts were formalities that left room for nuance. Ray convicted on charges of assault and intimidation, Celia found culpable in her role of enabling the crimes. There were sentences handed down that felt, to some, either too harsh or too lenient, but they carried consequence. The one thing that had been missing when they were running the village like a game, only they knew the rules to. When the locks clicked shut and the courtroom dispersed, an odd hush hung in the air in the village. It was not a silence of surrender. It was the expectancy of people waiting to rediscover life in the parts of their days that had been stolen. There were small celebrations. A pie passed at the pub, a collection of flowers left on the bench where children once sat to gossip. There were also scars. Families adjusting their rhythms, parents teaching children to say names and to mean them. For Marin and Rona, the outcome was a strange alchemy of joy and sorrow. They were grateful beyond measure that Dylan had woken, that he had spoken, that the machine of justice had turned. But they also bore a new knowledge of the world's fragility. "We got him back," Marin said one evening as he and Rona sat overlooking a dark river that reflected the town's lights. "But we also lost something along the way." Rona leaned her head on his shoulder and let the quiet say its piece. "We built something else," she said. "A place where people can choose." April, who had once felt like a pawn in a cruel game, began to stitch herself into a life slightly braver. She took a job at the bakery, moving between days of kneading and laughter. The village, always a living thing, adapted. It wore new names like a garment that needed to be tried on. People were kinder in ways that surprised them. They offered help without expecting something back. They held doors and listened. Dylan, for his part, carried his trauma like a map. Sometimes it led him back to dark places. Sometimes it pointed him toward light. He would visit the hospital where he had lain, to visit the nurses who had kept him between worlds. He would go to school, to classes where he learned that being young and vulnerable did not mean being voiceless. He learned to speak to crowds about the importance of telling the truth. His voice shook less each time. And Ray and Celia, reduced now to headlines and court records, were a cautionary tale in the village conversations. They had thought their power was permanent. It had been merely fragile, like packing paper that crumples under the smallest pressure. Their fall revealed not only their sins, but also the capacity for a community to rebuild when it had the courage to call injustice by its name. When spring came, the river thawed fully and the village seemed to breathe fresh air. There were still moments when hope and dread sat opposite each other, like two guests at a dinner table neither of them could leave. But the balance had shifted. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Emmerdale Echoes.